When a curious young bobcat finds a girl's body, it looks around, checking to see if other humans are nearby. She's all alone and covered in injuries. Then the bobcat does something incredible. Tilly had crawled as far as she could before collapsing in pain and exhaustion. Lying in the grass, she looked up at the sky as silent tears rolled down her cheeks. Slowly, her eyes closed, her last thoughts of her mama and how she would never see her again. Steve had seen to that. As white clouds washed over the sky, Tilly slipped into unconsciousness. Sniffing through the grass, a curious bobcat had detected an unfamiliar smell. At first, it had been unsure about tracking it, but curiosity got the better of it, and now it was following the trail. The scent was fading, though, and the bobcat soon lost interest, finding more enjoyment in wandering through the grass with the pleasant breeze in the warm air. Suddenly, it stumbled upon the girl's body by accident. She wasn't moving. The bobcat circled the girl and cocked its head from side to side, taking in all the cuts and bruises on her. She smelled of blood. It gently nudged the girl's hand, but she still didn't open her eyes. How had the young girl gotten here, and why was she all alone? The bobcat looked around for other humans, but there was no one in sight. Sensing the girl was in danger, the bobcat did something incredible. Tilly had closed her eyes, squeezing them so tight she wasn't sure she'd ever be able to open them again. Steve had been shouting at her mom again that morning. They'd all gone to the park, where Tilly had accidentally run into another child. The child cried, but Tilly and her mom apologized, and the matter was soon over. As usual, though, Steve exploded with rage when they got home, blaming Tilly for being reckless and clumsy. She knew Steve never liked her and hated that her mom always put her first. She hated it when he shouted at her mama. It made her want to run away. She thought that if she weren't around, her stepfather wouldn't have anything to be angry about, and he'd be kind to her mama. Little did she know Steve had already formed a plan to get rid of her. The day after the park incident, Tilly's mom was called in for an emergency at the hospital. Tilly was used to these things happening, but she hated being left in Steve's care. She tried to stay in her room and out of his way. It usually worked. She grabbed a book from her shelf, ready to escape into a world where her evil stepfather didn't exist. But no sooner had she read the first page than there was a knock at her door. Before she could answer, Steve flung it open, threw her blue polka dot wellies down, and told her to put them on. They were going out. Steve had never taken her anywhere alone, so Tilly felt cautious. She didn't want to defy him, though, so she pulled on socks, slipped into the boots, and trudged down the stairs, delaying having to go with her stepdad. But Steve was already at the front door with his car keys and a smirk. Tilly felt uncomfortable, hoping it would be a short trip so she could return to the safety of her bedroom and books. In the car, Steve seemed unusually happy, whistling along to the radio. He'd insisted she sit beside him, and though she wanted to be as far from him as possible, she didn't argue. Subconsciously, she squashed herself against the passenger door, picking at her nails with nerves. Just 5 minutes into the drive, Steve said something surprising. "Cheer up, Tilly Bob, we're going on an adventure." The young girl shifted uncomfortably. Only her mom called her Tilly Bob, and she hated Steve using it. But she was intrigued. Had her mama made him realize she wasn't such a bad kid? Was this his way of apologizing? She was wary but hopeful, willing to give him a chance if he was trying to make things right. Soon, Tilly noticed they had left their small town and were winding along country roads. Traffic had faded, and they seemed to be alone on the road. They'd been driving for a while, and Tilly had no idea where they were headed. Feeling slightly more at ease, she watched the trees whiz by. Hours passed, and Steve still hadn't stopped. Thinking they might have turned a corner in their relationship, she dared to ask him where they were going. He only smiled and sped up. Tilly began to feel scared again as Steve drove faster, everything outside a blur. This didn't feel like an adventure. She was back to being terrified of her stepfather. Before Tilly even had a chance to react, Steve unclipped her seatbelt, opened the passenger door, and pushed her out. The young girl screamed as she fell from the car and scraped along the tarmac. A pain like nothing she'd ever felt before shot through her ankle, and she looked on in shock as Steve drove off into the distance. With trembling fingers, she lifted her hand to her head and cried when she saw the blood. Her whole body hurt, but her ankle was the worst. She was still in shock, and the strange situation she now found herself in hadn't fully sunk in yet. As she tried to get to her feet, she screamed out in pain. She couldn't put any weight on it. As Tilly crawled across the tarmac to get out of the middle of the road, tears began to bubble up as she thought about exactly what Steve had done. He had dumped her hundreds of miles away from home so he wouldn't ever have to deal with her again. Eventually, the young girl found herself crawling along the grass. Although it was better than the tarmac, her head was hurting badly, and every movement sent a fresh wave of pain through her body. She had no idea what she was doing. She'd been hoping to see someone out walking or maybe a house, but all that surrounded her was grass and the forest in the distance. Her tears dripped off the end of her nose and hit the ground. She couldn't carry on crawling for much longer. Her head and ankle throbbed, and she felt sick from the pain. She collapsed onto the ground, thinking about how she would never see her mama again, as she drifted into unconsciousness. Tilly hadn't found anyone to help her, and she didn't have the energy to carry on. Little did she know that a curious bobcat would soon accidentally find her body. The bobcat weaved in and out of the trees, climbing on stumps and scaling fallen trunks. It was still young and had not long since become independent from its mother. The forest was like a huge playground to the young cat. As he stood on a fallen tree, he lifted his nose to the sky and sniffed. There was an unfamiliar scent blowing on the breeze that had caught his attention. He began to follow the smell and emerged from the forest and out onto the grass. The bobcat sniffed around, but the scent seemed to be slipping away, and soon he was more interested in chasing the butterflies and bees that flew through the grass, feeling the warm breeze rustling through his fur. Suddenly, he noticed something odd lying in the grass. He'd accidentally found the girl's body. At first, he jumped back in surprise, but when the girl didn't move, he began to circle her body. He'd seen humans in the forest before, of course, but he'd never seen one that looked like this. The young girl was covered in cuts and bruises. He cocked his head from side to side as if deciding what he should do. The bobcat looked around as if expecting someone else to come over to the girl, but there was no one else around. Tentatively but gently, he nudged her hand and then backed away, but the girl still didn't move. The young bobcat sensed danger. He sniffed around the girl, and the metallic tang of blood filled his nostrils. She was alive, but she wasn't waking up, and the curious bobcat knew something wasn't right. The only other human he knew of nearby was the old forester who lived on the edge of the forest. As far as the bobcat knew, the old man had never heard anything in his life, but the cat still felt wary. He was mischievous and curious, but even he knew that approaching humans was dangerous. This girl was different. She wasn't even moving, but the old forester would be, and he might not take too kindly to seeing a bobcat outside his home. There was only one thing for it, one surefire way to help the girl and hopefully keep himself safe. What the bobcat did next was incredible. Gently tugging on the girl's jumper sleeve, The bobcat began to drag Tilly as carefully as he could. He would take her to the forester, hoping the old man would see he was only trying to help, not hurt her. The girl was light, but it was still a lot of effort for the young bobcat to pull her through the grass while being careful not to hurt her more than she already was. After what felt like a lifetime, he saw the smoke billowing from a chimney in the distance. They were finally getting close to the forester's house. The bobcat was getting hot and tired, but he couldn't stop now. They were so close. He'd stumbled upon the forester's house one afternoon while exploring and was thankful he'd remembered the way, even though he tried not to hang around humans too much. The bobcat dragged the young girl through the leaves. He looked up as twigs and leaves got caught on her jumper and in her hair. He wished he could get rid of them, but getting to the house was more important. Finally, the girl was outside the forester's house. Now the bobcat just hoped his efforts hadn't been in vain and that the forester was actually home to help. Now that he'd arrived, he felt nervous. If the old man thought he was trying to hurt the girl, then he could be in danger. Still, he let out his distinctive cry and waited. Inside the cabin, the old man jumped at the sound. There was no mistaking the cry of a bobcat, but why did it sound so close by? The old man peered out of his window and stumbled back in shock. Outside was a young bobcat sitting next to the body of a girl. What was going on? The forester quickly pulled on his boots and threw open his front door. Had the bobcat hurt the girl? Suddenly, he regretted not grabbing something to defend himself. If the cat was dangerous, he needed to get it away from the girl immediately. But when he locked eyes with the cat, it began to gently nudge the girl's body. Although the forester would never know exactly how the bobcat had gotten the girl there, he sensed that the young animal had helped, not hurt her. The old man rushed forward and bent down next to the girl. Rather than being scared away, though, the bobcat stayed where he was. He was tired from dragging the girl and needed a rest. The old forester scooped the girl up and carried her inside his cabin, where he laid her down on his tattered old sofa and placed a blanket over her. He filled a dish with water and carried it back outside, placing it in front of the weary young bobcat, who gratefully lapped it up. The old man had no idea where the girl had come from, but looking at her injuries, her backstory couldn't be a good one. He needed to try and clean up her wounds in hopes she would wake up. Gently wiping away the blood, the forester noted how young the girl looked now that the dirt and blood were disappearing. Who would leave their child like this? Once she was clean, he tucked her in with another blanket and sat in his armchair waiting. An hour passed before the girl began to stir, and as she stretched and slowly opened her eyes, the old man saw her wince in pain. Waking up in a stranger's house had to be terrifying for her, and he wondered how much she remembered about her injuries. When she turned to see the old man, she pressed herself as far back into the sofa as she could, but her emotions were overwhelming, and she burst into tears. The old man fetched her some tissues and a glass of water and began to explain how he found her outside his home, with a bobcat looking after her. He told her the cat was even still outside waiting, which he noted got a small smile from the girl. Tilly was taking everything in. The last thing she remembered was lying down in the grass and thinking about her mama. She finished her glass of water and began to speak. Where did she even start with the story of how she'd stupidly trusted her stepfather, and he'd thrown her from his car just when she thought things might be getting better? She was feeling confused, but started from the beginning, telling the old man everything from when her mama had met Steve up to him throwing her from the car. The old forester was shocked and heartbroken, but hid his emotions from the young girl so as not to make her feel worse. When she'd finished, he held her hand and told her she was safe, but he had to phone the police, so she could get back to her mama and Steve could be held responsible for what he'd done. Before the old man called the cops, he noticed the bobcat was still waiting outside his house. He opened the door and whistled. The young cat looked up, but didn't move, so the old man left his door open as an invitation to the cat while he dialed the police. Tentatively, the bobcat crept towards the door and stuck his head in, but when he saw the young girl awake on the sofa, he crossed the threshold and went straight to her. While the old man was on the phone, he heard an unexpected noise in the background. The young girl was giggling while the bobcat playfully licked her hand. The old man's heart melted. After everything she'd gone through, she was still finding a reason to laugh. Not only had the bobcat saved her life, but he was now making her dark world a little bit brighter. It wasn't long before the cops arrived at the old man's cabin, and Tilly's mom wasn't far behind them. The girl was drifting off to sleep with the bobcat watching over her, but when she heard her mama's voice, she called out to her. Her ankle was still too sore to walk on, even though she desperately wanted to jump up and run to her mother. The two reunited in a tight hug as her mama wept and stroked her little girl's hair. She promised Tilly that Steve would never hurt her again. He'd already been arrested by the cops, but her mom didn't want to get into all that with her just yet. It would be hard enough for her daughter to give a statement about what he had done to her. When she finally let go of her daughter, Tilly's mom repeatedly thanked the old man for all of his help, but the old man told her if it hadn't been for the bobcat, Tilly might still be stranded. The woman looked at the young animal curiously. It was hard to believe a wild cat had saved her daughter's life. But she sat and listened as the forester explained how the cat had behaved. He told her he believed the bobcat had dragged Tilly's body to his cabin for help, and she suddenly felt very grateful for the cat. She gently reached out and stroked the bobcat's head in thanks. As the cops drove away, leading Tilly and her mom to the police station to give a statement, the old man and the bobcat watched them go. The young cat took one last look at the forester and made his way back into the forest. Tilly, the old man, and the bobcat would never see each other again, but they were bonded by a memory that would stay with them forever. Even as Tilly got older and the memories of Steve began to fade, she'd always say her favorite animal was a bobcat for the rest of her life. Now it's over to you. What do you think of the story? Do you know of any incredible animals saving humans? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.